This is Distant Replay.
Welcome in. This is Distant Replay. I'm Ben George. Great to have you. Look, instant reaction from the national championship game, right? Everybody's talking now after this Ohio State performance, the big win over Notre Dame, in which they pretty much dominated a 34-23 game. It looked closer towards the end than it probably ever truly was. But now it's got people talking, hey, is this one of the best college football playoff teams of all time? And it's a worthy question because this team is loaded, right? We saw the roster loaded top to bottom, extremely talented receivers, great line, Caleb Downs, that defense, and they have a lot of talented players. But are they truly the best? Where do they rank in the college football playoff era? We have 11 teams now dating back to 2014, where Ohio State won the first ever 14 playoff, now won the first ever 12-team playoff. But are they truly the best? Now, you can make your arguments, but I'm going to share with you who I think actually probably is a much better team than Ohio State, and maybe where this Buckeye squad would slot in this college football playoff era, because you can make arguments up and down the roster. Now, please subscribe if you haven't done that already. We try to turn out as much content as we can. We've been a little bit slower, but trying to pick it up a little bit. But we're going to go back to some old games, true crime, and more. So please hit subscribe. We appreciate the support. And leave a comment, too. Tell me what you think. Who do you think the best college football playoff championship team has been? Now, keep in mind, this Ohio State team wouldn't even have been in the playoff, right, if it wasn't for this new era. And it makes you wonder, truly, how many other teams would have been in the same position as Ohio State had they gotten the opportunity. And you go back and play the what-if game dating back to 2014, and there are a lot of good teams that just got left out. We hear the argument every year, is this team good enough to get in? Well, this Ohio State team was down the list of pretty good ways, and if not for a 12-team playoff, would have been in the mix. So I think they're in the mix of some other teams that got hot late, were good later in the season, but didn't quite get in. But here's who I think I would pick if I had to put in some teams that are a little bit better than Ohio State. Now, let's go through the list. I know automatically the first team that comes in mind, right, is this LSU team, 2019. Joe Burrow, that talented offensive lineup they had. I mean, this is a team that could score as efficient as possible. Coach O, right? I think they did a pretty good job overcoming Coach O, I think. But Burrow, Heisman Trophy, largest margin in the history of the award. This team went on to defeat a bunch of top 10 teams. Texas was number 9 at the time. They went to Austin. They beat a Florida team that was number 7 at the time, beat Auburn, number 9, went to Alabama, won that game against the number 3 ranked Alabama, and then beat number 4 Georgia, the SEC championship game, number 4 Oklahoma, and number 3 Clemson to win it all, 42-25 in that national championship game. So you can easily make the argument that this LSU team right here was one of the best, if not the best team ever. Now, I would argue, and if you listen to this channel at all, you'll know that I am an Alabama grad. I do try to stay pretty neutral where I can, but I would even say, you move on to this Alabama team in 2020. Now, this Crimson Tide team, 13-0, 10-0 in the SEC. Remember, now this is the COVID year. So this was a time when Alabama had to play a complete SEC schedule, right? They had to go through and play 10 SEC games. Hadn't happened before, hadn't happened since. I know there are some push to go to a bigger conference schedule. This Alabama team not only had to navigate this all SEC schedule, which is tough enough in itself, but they also had to deal with all the COVID restrictions. And you have to kind of take yourself back to that time when you didn't know when guys were going to get sick. Coach Saban had to coach what was a game from home because he had COVID. But you had to navigate all that stuff, all the testing, all the travel restrictions, all of those things to make it through the season. Remember, the Big Ten only played a half a season essentially, and this Alabama team eventually ran Ohio State out of the building in Miami in front of less than 15,000 fans. But you go back to this team as well, and I would even argue, it's crazy to have that 2019 and 2020, those teams back to back. But I would even argue that this team was more efficient offensively than that LSU team. That LSU team could play, but they were in some tight games. This Alabama team, you look through their whole schedule, they played an LSU team in Oxford that was a 15-point game. But this team was regularly scoring 40 points. Only twice did they score under 40, a 31-point win against Notre Dame in the semifinals and a 38-point win to open up the season at Missouri with the two times they scored under 40. And that Notre Dame game in that semifinal, if you remember, that Notre Dame team under Brian Kelly was just trying to play it close. They didn't have any intention, it seemed like, to try to push the envelope, try to win that game. I feel like they went in like, we don't want to really get embarrassed in this game. We're going to run the ball. We're not going to be aggressive. We're just going to try to milk the clock. And Alabama had no issues in that 31-14 game. And then against Ohio State, obviously Devontae Smith had an all-time first half. And if not for getting hurt in the beginning of the second half, who knows what he could have done in that game. Over 200 yards, right, receiving. And he could have gone on to do much bigger things in that game, and who knows what the score would have been. But it didn't matter. That Alabama team ran the table. So I would actually probably put Alabama slightly ahead of LSU, but you can make the argument, I think, either way on those two teams on who was actually better. Now, beyond that, who would you put next? I think you have to make an argument for two teams. I'll start with Georgia. Now, again, undefeated. Undefeated still speaks more to me than what this Ohio State team did, even though they were loaded, had a very expensive roster. This Georgia team navigated the season in 2022 to go on to beat TCU. Remember that blowout in that championship game? You could maybe make the argument that the year prior was maybe a little bit better team, but when they beat Alabama in the national championship, but they did lose to the Crimson Tide in the SEC championship. But this Georgia team finished 15-0, went to the second straight national championship for Kirby Smart and that Bulldogs team. And when you look back through this team as well, they had obviously the close game against Ohio State in the semifinals, which they needed a little bit of luck maybe to win that game by one. And they had a couple close games during the season, 4-point win at Missouri and a 10-point win at Kentucky. But this team was good, and they played some ranked teams, including winning against number 1 Tennessee that year. So I like them in the mix. Overall, I think just a very, very strong team. And Stetson Bennett won't blow you away as a quarterback, but he got the job done and really rose to the occasion for those Bulldogs team and really etched his name and his legacy there in Athens. All right, the last team that I would maybe consider alongside of them is this Clemson team. Now, this Clemson team in 2018, 15-0, again, 8-0, again, these undefeated teams in the playoff. Pretty obvious, I think, to put them ahead of Ohio State in 2024 just because they ran the table on the season. But I think these teams were also slightly more talented. Sometimes, in some cases, much more talented, especially offensively and a little bit defensively too. I think some of these teams, including this Clemson team, was very good defensively. Now, I think who knows what happened in this national championship game, the blowout. The only time, really, one of the few blowout losses Nick Saban has suffered, 44-16 in that game, and in which Alabama could do nothing from pretty much the entire final three quarters. Now, you look at the yardage. Alabama had more first downs in that game, only 40 fewer total yards despite the 44-16 game. But this Clemson team beat an Alabama team, okay, that had Tua and Jalen at quarterback, Najee, Damian Harris, Josh Jacobs running the football, Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, Henry Ruggs, all those guys, all those weapons were on this team that would eventually go on and win a national championship together a couple of years later, and for most of these guys. But this Clemson team also, Trevor Lawrence had an incredible game. ETN, Trevor, running the football was very good. Justin Ross, T. Higgins, they had some good receivers there as well. Hunter Renfrow. So they had some players there. This Clemson team, I think you can kind of argue because of the way they won the national championship in such convincing fashion over an undefeated Alabama team at the time who came in ranked number 1 and didn't do a whole lot wrong this season is why I put them in the argument. Now, where does Ohio State actually slot in? Look, I don't know where you'd actually put them when you look at everybody, but what I would say is I would kind of have them on par of their predecessor, Ohio State, in 2014. This Michigan team, look, you might argue SEC bias. If you're watching this channel, where's Michigan? I think that Michigan team was very good last year in 2023. I don't think they were an all-time team, though. I think they had a very, very manageable regular season schedule, won a couple of big games that they had to win, including that game over Alabama, which, again, you run that one back. Shocking that Alabama gave up that lead late to that team. Michigan did win that game, went on to win the national championship in a convincing fashion over Washington. So they were a very good team. And I would have them right below that group of undefeated teams. But I would also have this Ohio State team. Could they beat, even going back to 2016, that Alabama-Clemson matchup in Tampa? Those two teams, very, very good. The year prior in 15, also incredible national championship game, and those two teams, very high level of football being played. And I just think back to a lot of those squads had really strong defensive teams. Although the scores, that 45-40 game, you might not say great defensive teams, but they had a lot of studs on the field for that game. So where's Ohio State rank? I'm not going to sit here and try to rank all 11 teams. I think they're kind of middle of the pack out of the 11. Now, middle of the pack out of the 11 is still incredibly good, right? It's still one of the all-time teams that have to run this gauntlet. And that's where the argument I think you can make on the Buckeyes is they had to win this postseason playing the schedule they did, a Tennessee team, an Oregon team, to kind of run through those teams in the fashion that they did. And, getting into that national championship, you could tell they're playing as good as anybody. And if they play this way all year, they would have run the table and probably finished undefeated, and they would be in this conversation for all time. But when you take the full body of work, you can't put them in the mix with all those other top teams. Now, still a national championship, and Ohio State earned it this year and had an incredible team, and they'll bounce back and they'll return in 2025 to have a team again that should compete, and we'll see what moves they make in the offseason and see where they are, but still have a ton of young talent that's really good, and they should be back in the mix. But to run the table, very good. But I for those that are rushing to say this team was one of the best of all time, I would pump the brakes just a little bit. All right. Let me know what you think too. Drop a comment. Hey, your opinion is as valuable as mine. That's just what I think, reflecting on what we saw last night and looking back over this college football playoff short history. Who knows what the future years are to bring, but please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Appreciate you watching.